tribe was located, a lot of the location of the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe people are still in Canada, but there are large reservations in northern Minnesota, and Cass Lake Reservation. There's the Mille Lacs Reservation. There is the Red Lake Reservation. There are 7 reservations, all in northern Minnesota.
In early fall, the rice was ripe. People moved from their summer camps to the swamp areas and harvested wild rice. When winter came, the Anishinaabe men spent their days hunting and fishing, and ice fishing, and the women, on the other hand, spent their days making clothing and household items. In springtime, they moved to maple forests to collect sap from the trees and boiled it down into syrup and sugar. They collected bark and birch trees to make containers, shelters, and canoes. In the summer, big groups of families camped together and returned to the same spot year after year. Men spent their days hunting, fishing, and building canoes. Women dried meat and fish, and planted gardens, and gathered berries from the forest. So did you ever have to make stuff for your house?
Yes, I worked in the woods with my father and my 4 brothers, so I didn't do a whole lot of beadwork and that sort of thing. In the fall, you talked about wild rice, and we did go to what we called rice camp, and this is where we gathered as groups, and there were wigwams, or in some places there would be a framed kind of a little house sort of thing, and it's sort of like a hut. And that's what my dad had. Rather than a wigwam, he had four walls. And so we would harvest wild rice, and this is a wild rice fanning basket, because my mother and father would go out in the canoe, and my mother had what she called, those are ricing sticks, and those were sticks that were whittled by my dad, and they had to balance. And then you would take the rice and you would pull it over and you would slash at it. You wouldn't hit it this way. If you hit it that way, you would knock the stalks off the top, and then the rice wouldn't, the green rice would not stand up. But if you just hit it sideways, then inside of the boat, all of the finished rice, or the rice that was already ready to be harvested, would go into the boat. And so that's my mother, and she is what they call pounding rice into the boat, and my dad would stand behind her with a push pole, and the push pole would be almost really, really tall, about 20 feet tall. And he would just push it along, and they would probably talk a little bit, but mostly work. And they would bring in all of this rice. And then when you brought the rice in, then you had to parch it over a wood fire. And if you parched it, you had to get all the chaff off of them, because it's like wheat, to get to the kernels. And whoopsie. And my mother would have the rice in here, and she would stand and she would throw it up like that, and then the chaff would fly out and the good rice would stay inside. So that is a fanning basket, and that is harvesting wild rice in the fall. And then when you go in the fall, you'd go into the winter camp. We didn't have winter camps because we lived in our house, so because we had to go to school. And school was very important to my parents, and to other parents too, so that we all went to school. And while we were in school, my father would go out and trap. He would trap beaver. There's a picture of him there, and these are beaver pelts, and that's the skin side of the beaver that's stretched. And then he also sometimes would get otter, and they would be in the trap, and so he would have to skin the otter, and that long skinny thing is the otter. And then he also would trap muskrats. Muskrats didn't bring as much money as the beaver. And the mink. Mink was a very, very important part of his trapping. And then in the spring, we went to Sugar Bush Camp. And Sugar Bush Camp was a lot of fun, and this is where I can show you this piece. My mother and my grandmother used to make these containers, and they were made out of birch bark. And my mother could make these, and they would use these to gather up the syrup. And they never leaked. They never leaked. They would bring it in, and they would be large. This is just a replica I had her make for me a long time ago. And I told her I'd put dried flowers in it. But that's what they would put their sap in there, and then they would take it, and then they would have this big kettle that would have over a fire, and then they would pour that sap in. Have you ever finished maple syrup?
I've seen Greg do it.
Yes.
And then he like boils it all down.
And you keep boiling, and they bring it in there, and then my grandma would sit there, and she would watch it boil and boil and boil and boil, and then we would get our syrup for the whole year, and then we would get our maple sugar. We went berry picking. We used to go berry picking in the summertime. We'd have berry picking camp. And when we went berry picking, you know, there were 6 children, but we all had to pick berries. Even the little bitty kids had to pick berries. And whenever we went berry picking, we all got a stick of gum. We never used to get gum for anything else, but berry picking we got gum. And now I know that the reason my mama gave us gum was because if you're chewing gum, are you going to be eating berries?
Nope.
I think they were always smarter than us.
That was pretty smart.
That was pretty smart.
Once you spit it out,
and we would get a lot of different kinds of berries. We did raspberry picking, and we did blueberry picking. We didn't do so much strawberry picking, but we did a lot of raspberries, blackberries, and blueberries.